we stand with the working people and the civilians.
No supposed leftist unity is worth throwing working people under the bus.
Yeah. People are people.
Yeah.
We stand with the small guy, regardless.
And I actually, Hayan, I don't think you know this, but when I was first started talking about like some of the more political stuff, I don't remember which post it was, but I used to get a bunch of Syrians who would get mad at me for being anti-regime, which I was used to, but then they would start getting, well, who do you side with? And then like it's like a trick question because like no matter who you say, you can point to someone and be like, oh, they're horrible. I think that was the conversation about the PKK or whatever. Which, you know, they're problematic. But the point is, Hayan would often answer like, just I stand with the Syrian people. And it was like a great response. And I started using that as like a more canned response whenever that would come up, because that's always the correct answer. It's like whatever's best for them. And then they would be like, well, the best thing for us right now is the regime. And then you'd be like, oh, well, obviously that's not the case. Here's a ton of reasons why that's not true. You know, like a people first approach is like how the conversation starts.
I credit that to learning about rhetoric and philosophy from beginning of high school. It's such an invaluable skill that I think everyone should be learning philosophy from kindergarten even, because this whole whataboutism trend that started around Trump's time, it's called sophism. It's called to quote. There's a word for it that's been established. Every civilization has had sophistry, or people who use these rhetorical tricks to influence and gain power. And education is the only defense against it. And if kids today were taught about whataboutism and all these different rhetorical tricks, they would be less susceptible to propaganda from imperialism.
Could you imagine if we started teaching how to spot propaganda in like middle school? Like people would go ballistic. They would hate it.
It wouldn't have to be called that's why you call it a philosophy class, call it a rhetorics class. Don't make it political, because it's not. Even in your everyday life, you know, you can tell when someone's lying by the way that they speak. If they're not addressing a certain topic, but they're trying to divert the question, or if they're passing the burden of proof onto you. These are all things that very standard for first year students in my school to take it. And I failed the class at first, but it turned out it was the most invaluable lesson I could have learned.
I mean, all of this education would require an actual public education system.
Yeah.
The whole PR thing, they start using PR on you. Instead of teaching you about PR, they use it on you from like day one.
Exactly. And the education system itself is obviously a great source of propaganda to control your citizens. And obviously there's propaganda in every country's curriculums, but the education system in Syria has been weaponized against the people to such an extent that schools are brainwashing centers. They're not.
Yeah.
They're not.
It's pure indoctrination. It's the entire purpose of every course. So
and it's violent indoctrination. Any speaking out, you get physically hit, and there's teachers who are actual feds that work for the government, and they monitor students who are dissenting or maybe saying something a little too activisty. By the way, you could be pro-Palestine and just saying something like, I support Palestine against Israel. But if you're seen as a group leader that's like organizing stuff, oh, you're a person of influence, like we better get a handle on him before he tries to maybe take his initiatives from Palestine onto us, you know? So even like, because the Assad regime is supposedly pro-Palestine, but if it sees somebody protesting, or it was against the Iraq war, but it arrested 200 Iraq war protesters in Damascus. It wasn't, you know what I mean? Like, it's
because they're dissenters. They just don't want people gathering.
It's not about what they're protesting. It's about the fact that they had the nerve to protest.
Because in the end, what they look for is people who can be controlled and who can be, and people who even have like a history of any dissent or of gathering in groups really at all in any sort of like dissenting fashion. They'll target them, and basically they'll test like a student to see if they're controllable or not, and if they're not, they'll take them away to get re-educated or whatever, regardless of what they were actually speaking about, even if it supposedly aligns with the regime.
So when did like all that, like, has it gotten a lot worse, significantly worse? Was it always there? Or has it just been under Assad that they've gotten more?
Yeah, so when his dad came into power, it was really like the start of the Ba'athist Party's power. So they took over when Egypt and Syria became united. And at the time that the president of Egypt became Syria's president, like, he closed down all opposition parties. He began the sort of police state infrastructure where there was more surveillance and you could be arrested arbitrarily. And he started also, I think, torturing dissidents as well. And this was in the early 60s, and Hafiz Al Assad, Bashar's dad, was the defense minister at the time, but he had a lot of like influence and power as well, to be able to make these decisions. So it was a lot of like infighting to try to gain power, and then by the end, by 71, I think it was, or 70, Assad had officially kind of well, because Egypt and Syria dissolved again, and
Yeah.
we were back to just being two states. But Baathists stayed in power, so there's a Baathist party in Egypt and Syria. The Egyptian Baathist party left. Syrian Baathist party maintained authority and still banned all opposition parties, which is the first time we'd had that forever. Like all throughout Syrian history, before the Assads and before like Baathism, we'd had opposition parties. We'd had, you know, some freedom of the press and some, you know, like some semblance of electoral democracy. And the longest administration before Assad had been maybe 5 years maximum, and now Assad is 50 years. So so the education system began under Hafiz al-Assad, and through the corrective movement, the first year that he was in power, he implemented more and more like of these kinds of like our history curriculum is entirely based on like a lot of it is heavily emphasizing the Crusades. Now, why? Why would that be so important, right?
Mm.
Because it's seen as a existential threat against imperialism, that they can kind of steer towards solidarity with their government against Israel, because it's all about liberating Jerusalem, right? And by forming this enemy of Zionism, you get them on your side of saying like, because if we're against Assad, then we must be Zionist sympathizers. We must be like anti-Palestinian, you know?
Yeah.
And this had started with Hafez and continued under Bashar too.
Yeah. And it was definitely, it was, you know, quote unquote stable for like decades for sure. Which is why, you know, I was able to visit Syria a ton growing up. But the destabilization kind of increased more and more. Bashar is not really seen as the same kind of iron fist as Hafez al-Assad was, and just continue like the Arab Spring and things like various destabilizations in the region, which eventually led to the civil war. Like you could definitely kind of see it unraveling even before Bashar took over. Like it was always going to be unsustainable. Hafez did, you know, it kind of did continue until his life ended. But even that was kind of weird because he actually had another son who like died in a car wreck. So he was supposed to be the one who took over, and actually like the backup kid took over, who just wanted to be like a dentist. So yeah, you could see it in kind of the woodworks coming, and they were getting more and more desperate, more and more broke. The internet was terrible for them, you know, stuff like that. So it just kind of all came crashing down eventually.